When we're talking about the issue of money in the 1790s, it's really important to kind of put this into context. And just like Mr. Miller taught you guys in the last few weeks, we're fresh off the Revolutionary War in the 1790s. We have our first president. We're trying to kind of figure out every part of having a new country and how everything's going to flow and work. So obviously money is the root of everything in a country and the root of everything in everything. I mean, it's money. So we're looking at George Washington trying to figure out how are we going to circulate this money and how are we going to, get the economy going. So the founding fathers get together once again about another issue, and it's George Washington, who's our president, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, who you guys will see pulls a lot of strings with the finances in the early years of our country, and Robert Morris. So Robert Morris is really important to talk about because he introduces the idea of establishing a U.S. Mint. And the U.S. Mint is an institution that's dedicated to producing coins and controlling movements of those coins all around the world. So this is so important because by doing this, you're having these coins circulating in a way that makes sense. And through the Coinage Act or the Mint Act of 1792, we now have the silver dollar. And the silver dollar takes this issue of having different currencies in different states and it fixes it. So now we have the same money, and through the U.S. Mint, it's circulating properly. So this issue is being fixed through the Constitution, through the fact that the government is working under the Constitution, and it's really going to kickstart the economy, help with some of this war debt, and start to get things going in terms of, money, finances, and just being on the right track as a new nation. Okay, so when we're talking about April 5th, 1792, it's really important to go into detail about what a veto is, why this specific veto happened, and why it was important. But first things first, there's a video connected. It's Schoolhouse Rock. I was tortured by it in high school and in middle school, and it kind of forced me to remember what a bill, what a law, and what a veto is. So if you want to watch it, you can. It's right there. It's really great actually to remember all this information because it sticks in your head for the rest of your life, literally. But regardless, I'm going to go over what a veto is, so this all makes more sense. So a veto, when we're talking about the United States, is when the lawmaking body, which is Congress, proposes a bill that they agreed on that they think is a great idea for the country, and they basically propose it to the president and ask it to become a law. And if the president decides that it's unconstitutional and that it doesn't make sense for the country, he then vetoes it and it never becomes a law. So long story short, on April 5th, 1792, George Washington reluctantly and a little nervously decides that he's going to say no for the first time, and he does that. So this bill that he says no to is asking if the northern states can have more seats in the House of Representatives than the southern states. So this would have changed the number of seats that were already kind of written into the Constitution. To go a little farther with this and to clarify a little bit more, the Constitution laid out that for every certain number of citizens of the United States, there is a certain amount of House of Representative seats. And this bill would have changed that around. So this is so important because George Washington is saying that under this new Constitution, this is unconstitutional, so I'm going to veto this. This isn't just important because it's the first veto. This is important because it's saying this is the Constitution. This is the power the Constitution has, and it has the power to have George Washington veto this bill. Okay, so I'm sure that some of you have seen The Wolf of Wall Street. So when we think of The Wolf of Wall Street, we're seeing stocks, we're seeing stock market, we're seeing this immense, insane amount of success and money and the economy thriving off of these things. So that's really what I think of when I think of the Buttonwood Agreement. So when we think about the Buttonwood Agreement, we're seeing 24 stockbrokers meet underneath a Buttonwood tree on Wall Street in 1792. And they're not just gathering around underneath this tree and talking about money and thinking, oh, that'd be nice to do this and do that. They're really getting together and changing the society and the world as it affects us still today. So when they got underneath this tree, they set the foundations and they laid the roots for what is now the New York Stock Exchange, which doesn't just heavily affect our economy, it really kind of flows into the economies all around the world. When they sat underneath this tree, they decided that no auctioneers would be involved and a commission would be set at 0.25%. They really created this comfort and this flexibility between the markets and the consumers, and they redefined the industrial North. So instead of the entirety of the country before and after the American Revolutionary War being really dependent on agriculture and, the trading of agriculture, and that was the basis of how they made their money, they're now saying, no, we're going to take this in a different direction. We're going to take this in the direction of market and stocks and more of an industrial way of boosting the economy. And as you'll see further into the United States history, as the country gets a little bit older and things change, you'll see that this creates this divide between the northern and the southern states. So not only did the Buttonwood Agreement really benefit the country and it boosted the economy, it also really created this different way of living in the North and in the South. Before the White House was called the White House, it was first called the Executive Mansion. After George Washington picked out the site for the famous building, the design created by Irish immigrant James Hoban began to unfold on October 13, 1792. Outside of the fact that this is one of the most famous buildings in the world today, it's important to recognize the significance behind the design. James Hoban, who was not of the American elite, submitted his idea for the famous building, as well as Jefferson too. Where most Americans at this time would immediately assume Jefferson's design would automatically win, the decision to choose Hoban's design signified a new acceptance of ideas from those outside of the elite, which was huge, and a huge progression at this time in history. Although George Washington had an important role in the beginning of this building, John Adams was the first president to live in the building, not our first president. Adams had already lost his second election to Thomas Jefferson, but had a rivalry with him so intense at this time that he decided that he would be the first president to live in the Executive Mansion, not Jefferson, even though his presidency was basically over. This building was not originally named the White House, but gained the title as early as 1809, and although it was burned in the War of 1812, it was rebuilt and still houses our presidents today. The Whiskey Rebellion was in response to a federal tax placed on corn, which was the main ingredient in alcohol. This tax infuriated farmers and distillers in West Pennsylvania. Prior to this, tensions had been hitting a boiling point between tax collectors, the wealthy, and angry farmers summoned for taxes in Pennsylvania. But in 1794, the violence truly erupted in a conflict, with wealthy tax collector John Neville and an angry mob of farmers who he summoned to pay tax. Before this situation could escalate even more and spread to Pittsburgh, George Washington made the huge decision to put down the rebellion with the help of 12,000 troops. Washington being able to successfully defuse this situation really proved the validity and the success of the new Constitution. And just like many other pieces and parts of the 1790s, this reaction really justified how well the country was going, even if the success had to be shown through a rebellion and the response to the rebellion. So during the American Revolutionary War, it really wasn't uncommon to see a lot of the indigenous people in America side with the British and hope that they would win. And the reason for them doing this is because they knew deep down that if the Americans won, they would continue to migrate more and more and more into their land and kick them out of it. And they were 110% right, because you see the Americans, the Continental Army, win the American Revolutionary War, and they begin to spread out. And you have the indigenous peoples really located in the Northwest Territory of the United States, but you see, the settlers in the United States move more and more and more west into their territory, and it's causing a lot of conflict. So in those areas, you see a lot of different tribes, and they're all making the decision to band together to defend their land. That way the Americans can't take it. So you see a lot of conflict with Little Turtle as their leader. And you see the Native Americans actually getting these minor victories, and they're winning over time. And this is beginning to irritate George Washington. And eventually George Washington sends General Mad Anthony Wayne and a lot of his disciplined troops that he trained very heavily to go into this land and end this for good. Because George Washington, overall, he wants more sovereignty over that land. He wants more ownership over that land, and he thinks that he needs to protect the citizens of the United States. And when I say citizens of the United States, I mean not the Native Americans, because this is a conflict between the Americans and the indigenous people. So when General Mad Anthony Wayne goes in, he ultimately gets the victory. So although Little Turtle and, all the tribes were winning minor victories, this was the end all be all. And this battle was called the Battle of Fallen Timbers. So when General Mad Anthony Wayne goes in and he takes the W in this, basically the indigenous peoples throw the towel in, trying to defend their land, and this leads into what would become the Treaty of Greenville. The Treaty of Greenville was signed in response to the Battle of Fallen Timbers, and it was signed between the indigenous nations of the Northwest Territory and the United States in 1795. This treaty outlined the promise of peace and the exchange of Native American and American prisoners that were taken from each side during their conflict. This treaty also, and really importantly, defined and redefined boundaries of the land that have caused so much conflict. The indigenous nations of the Northwest Territory would receive Illinois and Indiana, and the United States would now receive Ohio. The Treaty of Greenville seemed nice, and it promised a lot of great things, but my question is, did it stand? Did it fall through? Did America keep their promise? The Treaty of Paris did not fix our issues with Britain. They still maintained forts in the United States. They were selling weapons to Native Americans that were often used against Americans in conflict, and the British were harassing American ships. The act of impressment was very common at this time, which is when the British would steal our seamen, cargo, and ships, and often use it for their own British Navy. In the midst of all this unresolved conflict, Hamilton worried about war with England and stressed the need for a treaty. Chief Justice John Jay was sent as a delegate to get the treaty signed and to avoid further conflict with Britain. This treaty was wildly unpopular because although the British claimed to abandon forts in the United States and claimed they would pay for the damage from impressment, they did not agree to stop future impressment. They did not agree to stop selling weapons to Native Americans, and most things in the treaty were considered but definitely not solved. For once, Washington was being booed after this treaty, and he was receiving significant backlash after this treaty, which had never really happened previously. Pinckney's Treaty was a treaty signed between the United States and Spain. Unlike Jay's treaty, Pinckney's treaty was wildly popular and applauded in the United States. The terms of this treaty allowed the United States the right to the Mississippi River and the right to deposit goods in New Orleans. This also redefined the boundaries for Florida, which was a huge deal for the United States and for Spain. This treaty allowed the two nations to agree on navigation rights up and down the Mississippi River, which was a really big deal for American business at the time. In 1793, approximately 180,000 pounds of cotton was harvested in the United States. 2 years later, that harvest grew to more than 6 million pounds. By 1810, an astounding 93 million pounds were brought to harvest. So this is really important because this isn't a huge stretch of time at all, and you see this boom of the economy in the South due to cotton. So if you're just basing your assumptions on the pictures here. You're probably right. So the cotton gin was created, and this sped up the process of preparing cotton to be sold. So this was huge because prior to this, you had slave labor and just the hands of the slaves that had to go through this awful task of taking care of the cotton in such a particular way. So after the cotton gin was invented, people really thought slavery was done completely in the South. There was no need for their labor. And although slavery really did continue, it was really starting to slow down as a result of this cotton gin. But this was so important because although the North was becoming industrialized, you still had the South so deeply immersed in the world of agriculture and agriculture as a means for an economy. George Washington never wanted to be president to begin with, but nevertheless he was elected to be our nation's president not once but twice. After deciding to leave the presidency, he set the standard, which many presidents would follow after him, the idea of a two-term president. Before leaving office, his farewell address was written, some say 4 years earlier, by Alexander Hamilton, and it appeared in papers on September 19th, 1796. Okay, so George Washington's farewell address wasn't a nice, sweet, short little, okay, thank you for the presidency, I'm out of here. It was not like that. It was a big warning, and it was all of his feelings wrapped up in this document saying what he thinks America should do and what he thinks America shouldn't do, and basically what's going to doom America, and it is everything that happened after his presidency. So first things first, he talks about how political parties are the end-all be-all. It separates people, it's awful, and basically America should steer clear of letting political parties control things. And this is kind of funny to look at because right after he leaves the presidency, Jefferson and Adams kind of explode in this political party rivalry, and it sets the stage for the rest of American history, basically. I mean, we see now Democrats, Republicans, and obviously political parties have shaped and changed and morphed into different things over the course of the hundreds of years that the United States of America has been its country. But George Washington said, this is a huge mistake. Don't do this. And right after he leaves office, political parties explode into rivalries and really do divide sections of the country. And secondly, he talks about foreign affairs and things like alliances. And this was really important to him because he's saying, don't go into definitive alliances. If you need to have temporary alliances or alliances for certain specific reasons, that's fine, but don't get into alliances that really stick you with certain countries. And basically the countries within Europe are really where he's leaving his focus, saying that, there's a lot of issues with the European nations and you need to be careful not to get too involved in their issues and let them be too involved in our issues. We need to stay with our country and build from the inside. And everything that he said was a little too difficult to follow because if you look at the way the country has operated, it really needed help from different countries to even become the United States of America. So him asking to cut off the rest of the world when he was already kind of so deep into alliances and so deep into foreign relations and so deep into politics, it was difficult to ask, and it was kind of asking the impossible. Okay, so on the left you have John Adams, and on the right we have Thomas Jefferson. If you didn't recognize the paintings of them, you definitely recognize their names by now, because as Mr. Miller went over in the past few weeks, these two men are founding fathers. They are woven into every piece of the fabric of what the United States of America is. They're woven into every piece of the fabric of the Revolutionary era. They are huge in making the United States the United States. I mean, they are defining figures in our country's history. And this election between the two of them was really important for a few reasons. But first of all, it was important because, as we talked about George Washington's farewell address, he said that political parties would be the downfall of the United States. It would cause division and it would cause tensions and issues, and he was 100% right. Because as we can see from the map on the right, we can see kind of like the election results and the map having to do with their political affiliations and parties. So you see John Adams as a Federalist, and you see Thomas Jefferson as a Democratic Republican. So they're completely going against the guidelines that George Washington left after he, ended his presidency. They're having political parties. They're starting this ridiculously, tumultuous relationship and rivalry and conflict that will really continue for many, many years based on politics. And although John Adams does win this election, you can see that this is going to be a reoccurring issue that continues even until today with political parties. And the second reason why this is really important is because there is an election. I mean, we saw the American Revolutionary War happen because of the leadership of King George III. And now we get to see George Washington leave, and leadership completely leaves his hands. He wipes his hands clean of the presidency after 2 terms, and 2 new people are able to be brought in, and there's an election. So this really shows the way that our country changed from what it was before, and how the United States is really its own democracy.